In the epicenter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lies Gaza. This tiny enclave has grown impoverished by war and a blockade by neighboring Egypt and Israel. Some say a humanitarian disaster is on the horizon, but it's not a position frequently taken by many U.S. politicians, unless, of course, you're Congressman Brian Baird. This Democrat from Washington just returned from his third trip to the region, and he joins us here today. Thank you, Congressman.
It's great to be with you.
You've been vocal about the humanitarian situation in Gaza for some time now, and yet after this particular trip, you outlined some very specific steps that you wanted to see the United States take. Tell us what you want to see the United States and Israel do when it comes to Gaza.
Well, we've got an urgent problem and then a long-term problem. What I've called for is a Berlin airlift type measure using roll-on, roll-off ships. These are the kind of ships we brought relief to Haiti in, where you can just load them up, drive them right on up, unload the material, take it to the UNRWA people, the UN Relief Works Agency, store it there. They monitor every bit of it, take it to sites of specific use. For example, schools, hospitals, sanitation, housing reconstruction, account for every bit of it. Show the people of Gaza and the people of the world that the United States and the rest of the world are serious about getting help. That's not a long-term solution, but it's an urgent need, and we ought to try to fill it. In addition to calling for lifting the blockade, I think it's absolutely important that Special Envoy Mitchell and other members of the administration go firsthand to visit people in Gaza. In the long term, we need to insist that the Israeli government work to gradually open these borders. Not right away, not without adequate checks, but basically imprisoning 1.5 million people, more than 600,000 children, is not acceptable. It's not a good policy in the short term, and it will have disastrous consequences in the long term.
And yet you've been criticized for some of the positions you've taken.
Well, anytime someone tries to take an approach that looks at multiple sides of this complex issue, there's likely to be criticism, maybe from both sides. And unfortunately, I think our policies in this region have too often, there's been this attitude that if anyone ever, in quotes, sides with any issue on the Palestinian side or criticizes any conduct of Israel, that you are somehow anti-Israel or even worse, anti-Semitic or somehow disloyal to your own country. Nothing could be further from the truth. I am a strong supporter of Israel. And I just believe that Israeli policies in Gaza particularly, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, are first of all, in many cases, perpetuating injustice, but secondly, in the long run, not in the Israelis' own security interests. And I'm not alone in that. There are many, many people in Israel who share that thought, and I've met with many of them. Ironically, it turns out in the U.S. Congress there's often less freedom of speech on these issues than one finds in Israel itself.
Well, on that point, I mean, it seems like in U.S. American political culture, it's almost a taboo topic, like you said, to question any aspect of U.S. support for Israel. Why do you think that's developed, and does it have any negative implications for the U.S.?
We are at our best as a country when we adhere domestically and in our foreign policy to fundamental principles that our nation was founded on. Justice, freedom, First Amendment rights, those kinds of things. When we deviate from that, we are seen as inconsistent and hypocritical, and that applies around the world. What's troubling to me is that there is an assumption that the only way someone in our government, in our Congress, and maybe in the administration can speak out about these things is if they don't plan to seek re-election. Why should re-election of a member of the United States Congress depend on denying that there are legitimate concerns of the Palestinian people and of people in Israel, but looking at both sides objectively? That's of concern to me. The priority for a member of the United States Congress ought to be one thing alone. What is in the best interest of the United States of America? What is consistent with our core values? Not what will get me reelected, what will get me campaign contributions, what will make my life easier. My own belief is that certain policies of Israel these days, and really for some time now, are counterproductive to Israel's own long-term security, counterproductive to core values, which I hold dear, and I think many Israelis hold dear, and counterproductive and contrary to our own values. And so we have to work with our friends, as friends, and say, we insist on some changes. In the case of Gaza, we could bring immediate relief to citizens, to innocent civilians, without asking Israeli permission. We just roll the ships up, take the aid to the people who most need it, and show them that we care about them and get real, tangible quality of life improvements in the process without empowering extremists on either side. In the case of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, occupied territories there, I think we need to insist, not just verbally, not just say settlements shall cease and then turn a blind eye when they don't. We need to say if they continue, we will have consequential measures. Constraints on certain kinds of aid might be among that. Now, even saying in American politics that you might consider limiting aid is anathema. But how else do you do it? How else do we do that? How else do we communicate that we believe certain things are right, certain things are wrong, certain things need to happen? But if the other side, our ally, ignores us, we have to have consequences.
And yet, these comments have upset Israeli officials, some pro-Israeli U.S. groups. One group specifically called your plan for Gaza, quote, disturbing and outrageous, and even asked President Obama to repudiate these remarks. Why is there this outrage?
How can it be disturbing and outrageous to consider that people should have a right to hospitals, schools, water treatment, jobs, basic housing? What's ironic to me is what is really disturbing and outrageous is when the Israeli government says, no, you can't have pasta or garbanzo beans or basic needs because they're somehow strategically important. So there are disturbing and outrageous things being done in this region, but calling for relief to civilians is not one of them.
Congressman, in some ways it seems like Gaza poses a special problem for the United States. You talked earlier about values like freedom and democracy. We consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization, and yet it was democratically elected by the people in Gaza. Is it hypocritical in some ways for the United States to promote democracy abroad and yet support a blockade of a democratically elected government?
Well, let me be clear about one thing. I believe Hamas should change its fundamental charter to end any discussion of the destruction of Israel, and I think they should renounce terror. I don't endorse any form of terrorist organization. They should renounce terror, and they should end the call for the destruction of Israel, period. Having said that, there is certainly belief in the region among Palestinians and elsewhere that it is inconsistent for the international community to advocate democracy, and then if an election doesn't turn out the way you want, then blockade the country that had the election, or the region that had the election. There are no easy answers, and I want to be clear that I don't propose that there are. But we've got to find a way to have communication and cooperation. And if we say, as it tends to be our position, if we say any representative of Hamas in any form involved in any aspect of the government and all deals are off, how possibly can you resolve this? Should
the U.S. negotiate with Hamas?
We certainly should at least begin some form of back-channel discussions. It doesn't have to be through direct one-on-one, largely public ties, but a host of issues, in order to be resolved, have to involve representatives of Hamas. Let's suppose a model exists in which Hamas and the PA and the Fatah factions could in some ways work together. But then we say, we're not going to participate in any collaborative arrangement, then we are standing in the way of their reconciliation, and it's their reconciliation that will be necessary ultimately to create some form of state. So we've got to be pragmatic about this, and some form of discussion, perhaps back channel, perhaps through intermediaries, that leads to a better collaboration should be a goal.
Congressman, the district that you represent in Washington does not have a large Jewish or Palestinian constituency. You don't sit on any of the committees that have direct oversight over U.S.-Israeli policy. Why Gaza? Of all the conflicts in the world, why focus on this tiny sliver of land half a world away?
Well, wherever one travels in the Middle East or the broader Islamic world, there's no question in my mind that the treatment of the Palestinians and resolution of this issue is essential to a lasting peace. We cannot have it unless we resolve these issues. So we must try to resolve them. And it is also true that this is used as a justification in the minds of many for terrorism. I've traveled many parts of the world where people say, look, I don't condone terrorism, but their sentence will be, I don't condone terrorism, but what's happening in Palestine is wrong. And if you look at the concern of many, and I share it, about Iran's intentions and its actions. Many people throughout the world are greatly suspicious about Iran, but they get undue and unwarranted support for their perceived support of the Palestinians. It would significantly weaken the international standing of Iran and their, I think, nuclear aspirations if the issue of the Palestinian plight, both in Gaza and the West Bank, East Jerusalem, could be resolved in a just fashion.
And yet we live in a culture where an apology by Tiger Woods over a sex scandal gets minute-by-minute coverage, whereas crises like Darfur, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza barely make headlines. How do you get American people to care about this?
We have to deal with both of those. And it's much easier to worry about Tiger Woods or American Idol or any of the other nonsense that occupies our lives. But in the long run, ignoring the plight of these good people is at our own peril, because we are party to it. It is not some distant crisis that we had nothing to do with. It is a crisis that our taxpayer dollars are involved with on a daily basis, that our armaments are involved with on a daily basis, that our foreign policy is involved with on a daily basis, and that the world looks at and asks for more from the Americans. Not more in the sense of money, which we provide plenty of to all sides, but more in the sense of integrity and decency and justice and fairness. And that's where we're seen as lacking.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.